I was detailed to DEA as a U.S. Marshal, Special Deputy U.S. Marshal, investigating Jamaican cocaine gangs out of D.C. and Baltimore. We went down to Miami. I was in 4 shootings in a little over 10 years, and none of them were like what you hear on TV. The first 2, I never even fired a shot back. The second 2 were long, drawn-out affairs. And fortunately, everybody survived, including myself, obviously. Injured, yes, but survived.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned in to one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SASS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markell, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. This is episode 94, and this week I'm proud to bring to you my distinctive guest, the founder and host of Law Enforcement Talk Radio and Podcast, and retired Baltimore Police Sergeant John Jay Wiley. John Jay graciously agreed to give of his time and energy to tell us about his own trauma story and provide some of the wisdom and insights he gained as a police officer in Baltimore. This interview stands out as one of this podcast's unique opportunities to hear from someone who knows trauma from a different perspective than a sexual assault or rape victim. Yet, John Jay is able to draw parallels and commonalities to those of us who have experienced that type of interpersonal violence, because his trauma was still personal. Give this episode your full attention, and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Here's John Jay. John Jay Wiley is with me today. John Jay, thank you so much for being with me. It's a real pleasure.
It's an honor to be here with you, and I appreciate you sharing your stage. I know you work really hard at this. And the truth is, us retired police, we got to do something we can help each other with. So I do appreciate the invite. It's very, very much appreciated, to be honest with you.
Well, I appreciate that. Just so everybody in my audience knows, I was a guest on John Jay's podcast. Mm-hmm. And so, if you want to flip over to that and give that a listen, I'd appreciate it. John Jay would appreciate it. And become a subscriber to Law Enforcement Talk Radio also. John Jay's doing amazing things. I just would love for you to give my audience a history about yourself. Tell us your background, your law enforcement history, and what's going on today.
I'll start with where I'm at today, then I'll go into the policing. So I'm the host of the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast, and started the podcast only in 2017. And we got recruited by a radio station upstate New York, asking we create a radio version, which we did. Now we're syndicated by Talk Media Network, and we broadcast weekly on 116 affiliate stations to about 44 million combined population. And then it goes online as a podcast. So it's both. And the main thing that I think it sets us apart, Dave, is when we do shows from cops for cops, it becomes like in-service training. And people are like, oh my God, I'm not listening to another one of these. So what sets us apart is I tell radio, we do it for radio, what Investigations Discovery Channel does for television. So we have a lot of cops, a lot of active and retired ones, telling stories about investigating crime. Then we have some that talk about trauma they went through. And that's not just limited to police. That's also other first responders, military, victims of crime, their spouses, survivors. talking about trauma they went through, often crime-based, but not always. For example, I had a guest on recently, a couple guests, that there's one woman in particular, her husband was a retired Canadian firefighter, and he dropped out of a heart attack in his early 60s. And she talked about rebuilding her life in the grief process. So there's a lot of relatable content. So my police story is, I wanted to be a Catholic priest first, and I was in the seminary and doing all the priestly things you're supposed to do. And I went on a date, and I realized that the celibacy was not my calling. And so I remember telling my dad, my mom, it's junior year of high school, and they said, "What do you want to do?" And I was like, "I want to be a cop." They're like, "What?" Because that was not in our family. Extended family, yes, but in the nuclear family, no. And the reason why was I wanted to do the service. I wanted to be part of helping solve people's problems of protecting the innocent, the children, the elderly, and really solve and make some differences. I know it sounds corny, the differences in the quality of life issues. And I got hired by Baltimore, and I was immediately thinking, am I physically and mentally strong enough to handle this? I don't know if I could.
Yeah.
So long story short, I had a very successful career. I was detailed at DEA as a U.S. Marshal, Special Deputy U.S. Marshal, investigating Jamaican cocaine gangs out of D.C. and Baltimore. We went down to Miami. I was in 4 shootings in a little over 10 years, and none of them were like what you hear on TV. The first 2, I never even fired a shot back. The second 2 were long, drawn-out affairs.
Wow.
And fortunately, everybody survived, including myself, obviously. Injured, yes, but survived. And there was a couple other close calls. But a big part of it is when I got hurt in the last one, Dave, it was a stolen car. They had a bunch of crack cocaine, and this is back in revolver days. And he was reaching around for the cocaine, and I thought he was going for a piece, so I pulled out my gun, and he wrecked. And when I got him to the ground, because I was a pretty big guy, I've always been a pretty big guy, and it's been a kind of gym and all that stuff that police do. And he took me and him off the ground and was screaming, and he was built like Lawrence Taylor. And the fight was on. When I was trying to holster the revolver, the fight was on for the gun. And we fired off all 6 rounds, and while still in my hand. And it's pointing in my face, is his face, and back and forth. And I thought I sprained my wrist. And what was happening is I had 3 surgeries and 2 steel plates put in, and my right wrist and right hand was totally fused into place. And I was retired at 33. So then it's like, now what do you do? And then things got quiet. And that's where the real problem started for me. When things got, I had a little poem I wrote. I used to ride to the sounds of sirens. Now all I hear is my midnight screams. And it's for a long time. It's not like that anymore, but in the beginning, it was like that every night.
Yeah. Well, that's what this podcast is dedicated to, is sexual assault and survivors of rape and sexual assault. But the center is on trauma. And that's why I was honored to have you. It's not just about sexual assault trauma, but interpersonal violence. And I consider being a cop, your work is your life. And that does become interpersonal when you're getting into a shootout with somebody, when you're down with somebody.
To be honest with you, Dave, it's hard not to take that personal. Absolutely. When people are shooting at you, like, you don't even know me.
Yeah.
Why would you want to kill me?
Let's talk a little bit about that trauma, if you're willing and if you're able to. Tell me more about the impact that retirement had on your life, that poem, the whole issue of healing through that. What was that like for you?
It was a long journey, and it's a big part of why I do what I did. I want people to realize that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So no matter how dark it might seem, you're going through the really bad days. And for a lot of us, there's really, really bad days and then bad nights. But I did all the things wrong. I drank too much to try to get to sleep. I isolated. I didn't talk to my now ex-wife about it for all the right reasons. It's that, I don't want to burden her. I don't want her to know. Yeah. And I used to do this thing, Dave, where the soft body armor, when I took it off, you take the Velcro, and I do this psychological undressing. And I try to go from police Jay to, husband Jay, father Jay. But then it worked for a very long time until it didn't anymore. Then it's like, okay, I'll drink some beer on the way home. And then I'm just sitting in the lazy boy chair. My wife would call at the time, mini vacations, where I'm just watching stuff that's not good for me. you would try to talk to me and I wouldn't be there. The lights were on, but no one was home.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got retired, Dave, I started losing weight. I started getting depressed. I started getting all the PTSD things that people talk about, isolating, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the walking flashbacks, the feeling like I was going to snap on people all the time. Even though I didn't, I felt like it all the time. And then I began this thing of, how do I describe it? I wouldn't get hungry. I'm a big guy. I'm like 240 pounds. I got down to 184, not the right way. And I always tell people I've been fat and happy and skinny and depressed, and I'll take fat and happy any day over that. But here's what would happen was, I would get really hungry. And then as soon as I started eating, I would get nauseous. And I had this psychological thing like I was depending on someone else to feed me. And that really, it doesn't sit well with me. And then eating became an issue. And then I wasn't shaving. And then I wasn't showering. And then all the bad things you hear about were happening all at once. And here's the really baffling part. I remember looking in a mirror one day, shaving, which I didn't do often. I don't do often now, was thinking, how did I go from ladies' night in Baltimore in my 20s, my late 20s, and being promoted to sergeant and doing well, and then being married and having 2 kids and our second house, to in and out of mental hospitals and not being able to function. It's like someone pulled the rug out from under me, and I had no idea why.
Yeah. Wow. That's so typical of trauma, period. It doesn't have to be law enforcement trauma. It's just trauma in general, those kinds of same commonalities in the responses. Did you do any therapy? Did you go to counseling?
Eventually. And here's the thing, David. I know that you've been in this field for a long time, but I got diagnosed with PTSD, I think it was 1989. Back in, I called the dinosaur era. We didn't have nothing that they have nowadays. Yeah. And the solution was, and I'm not saying it's bad, was to dope me up with Ativan, Valium, and Klonopin. And if I could raise my hand too fast, that was the increase the dosage until I could find some other relief. And I went to therapy, and I didn't like that to begin with. And I eventually went to a treatment center that was no longer in existence. It was in South Florida, in Davie, Florida. It's called Seafield 911. And I remember they changed my medicine. I've been off medication for maybe 25 years now. But I go back in a heartbeat. But the psychiatrist said to me, he goes, if you do what we tell you to do, you're going to be fine. You're a garden variety case. You get sober, you stop drinking, and you treat your PTSD, and you stop thinking you're unique. You stop thinking you're special. And here's the real kicker. They asked me questions like, you don't think this should have happened to you, do you? You think it should have happened to someone else? Someone else deserves this more than you. And I had to say, yeah, I did. So that was hard to admit.
Absolutely. That's a tough question. And I think it's a great question, though. It really turns your eyes inward instead of looking out at the world saying, why me?
Yeah. The psychiatrist asked me, he said, I was sitting down on a couch, and he said, try to stand up. And I did. He goes, no, that's called doing. What you do is you do it till it gets difficult, and then you make an alibi. And you say, it's because of this that I can't do that. And he hit a nail right on the head. And he was absolutely right. I was using this as an alibi. It's like an arterial bleed. If you don't deal with the bleed, you're going to die. Yeah. Well, instead of me dealing with the bleed, I'm saying, I didn't cause this, someone else did, so they're responsible for me getting blood all over you. And all the things that were special in my life, I was chasing away because I was so angry. The one thing that came out all the time was either dead quiet or dead angry. That was it.
Yeah. You're talking about this from your perspective and from what you went through, all based on that episode in law enforcement. But there's impacts personally, too. Did you laugh? Did you have any good times through any of that time, or was it just that so dark time that there was nothing?
I had a great life up until maybe 28, 29. And then when things got bad, it got really bad. Yeah. What I didn't see was a slow decline. That's what I didn't see. Okay. There were certain things we did for coping skills that worked well until they didn't work anymore.
Yeah, for sure. What did you do to come out of that? How did that feel, and what changed in your life when that therapy started working, the realizations, like you said, those questions from your psychiatrist? What was that turnaround like, and how did that kind of wash out?
Well, what happened was, I know this sounds really corny because it did it to me at the time. The same psychiatrist said that they did some hypnosis session on me. And that was the first time I slept all the way through the night after. And it was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm like, I gotta go lay down. And I didn't get up till like 7 o'clock in the morning. And that had not happened in years. Yeah. And when I woke up, I felt not like it was all gone, but I felt like this is doable, that I could do something with this. I could have a better life. It wasn't all rainbows and unicorns after that, but it was a whole lot better, and it began the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Healing isn't linear, and trauma isn't linear. It's an up and down. It's a roller coaster.
It's way up, way down, and I had really high highs, and then when the lows got really low, my now ex-wife, she was a big part of the reason why she forced me into doing this.
So yeah, the things started turning around for you. What were you doing? Did you have some sort of a job you were attached to? Were you doing something to have an income, or was it all disability? And how did your social life look at that point?
Oh, it was so bad, Dave. It was so bad. Yeah. My first job, I remember I got selling pagers and the brick cell phones part-time. Remember those?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I was shocked that they offered me a job. And I think it was a friend of my family's that offered me a job. And I think it's because they felt sorry for me, to be honest with you. And I'd gone through the mill, and I jokingly say this. I was living in St. Mary's County, Maryland at the time. And my now ex-wife called the police because I was out of control. And she said, and I remember vaguely hearing her talk to them. She said, oh, yeah, he's a retired Baltimore City police, and he's out of his mind, and he's violent. Mm. Trust me, they sent everybody. They had barking dogs. They had everybody there. So, I would love to think that I suffered in silence and no one but my daughters felt it. It ruined my marriage. The poor deputies and the state police that got dispatched, they didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
I was bleeding all over a lot of people, and I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And it's like I was clueless because I was so busy blaming someone else for, look what you did to me. Mm-hmm. Instead of, look where I'm at, and this is not the kind of life I want to have. And I think that was really the starting point of things starting to change for me.
So are you able to tell us how the podcast got started? How in the world, getting from that past and all that trauma and all those issues, working yourself into a place where you are ready to host a podcast?
I remember walking foot patrol in Baltimore a long time ago. I think it was 22, 23. And I stopped into a barbershop and I was like, hey, how you all doing? I'm Officer Wiley, blah, blah, blah. And a guy said to me, he goes, dude, you got a great voice. You should be in radio. Yeah. You should be doing commercials. You could sell Afro Sheen. You could do what, it doesn't matter. Yeah. You're as white as the day is long, but you could sell stuff.
Absolutely.
And that memory stuck with me. And about 1999, I got the mic I'm talking on now. I bought it used, and I started the predecessor of podcasts were called audio blogs. So I started one, and it was very much a lifestyle show called Biker Bros. And it's all, we would go to these events like Daytona Bike Week, Oktoberfest, all this stuff, and go into it. And I went to a brokered radio station, which means basically you pay for your time. Okay. And you sell your own advertising. I did that for a couple of years. I went to night school, Connecticut School of Broadcasting, and I began to learn the intricacies of radio and television and all that stuff. And I got my first full-time radio job about 19 years ago. I've been an FM music jock ever since, up until about 2 months ago. And what I did in 2017 is I took everything I learned from radio, from all the great teachers that I had along the way, and said, I'm going to create a podcast, and I want to focus on very laser down to police and their spouses. And if you're going through this, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I partnered with a company called Law Enforcement Today at the time, and they had about 630,000 people on their Facebook page, and they were allowing me to post episodes organically there. And we did an episode with a now retired female police officer who was shot multiple times with a SKS rifle in Auburndale, Florida, and almost killed her. And she had the audio from the dispatcher with the backup units, all that stuff, and they couldn't find her. She had to crawl on one arm to her neighbor's garage to get a line of fire. That's the episodes they heard and said, we need this. And so from that point on, it began to blossom out a little bit. Now we got to talk to firefighters. We got to talk to the military. We got to talk to victims of crime. We need to open this up a little bit more. And right now, about 75% of all my guests are talking not so much like your episode where we talked about investigating these crimes, but these are people telling their experiences of being the victim of a crime and how it impacted them, or how the suicide death of their spouse impacted them, and what they did with, and how it motivates what they do today. And we found that there is a huge market for that type of content. And basically what I do is not scientific. I do a little intro like you did and let them tell their story. It's it. There's no 60 minutes gotcha questions. I'm not here to do the Spanish Inquisition. I'm not here to do that stuff. I did that in police work. I don't need to do that anymore. Just tell your story.
Yeah.
And in a safe place. I'm not going to judge you.
Absolutely. And that's what I think what makes my podcast so compelling and listened to. I mean, my audience is growing. I'm just a small little podcast. I have maybe
now, but you'll get there.
Yeah. Well, it's growing like crazy. It's shocking to me. I started out with, I think, like 450 listens, and now I'm pushing 3,000, and I can see on the horizon where 3,500 is getting there.
I'll tell you, I didn't check my stats, but the total downloads for my show, for the podcast version of the show, is about 1.65 million.
That's amazing.
Right.
Wow.
And it's simple things we can do, but it's the thing about podcasting that you get, but a lot of people don't get, is it's creating a show. It's broadcasting. It's not, hey, I'm going to tell you how smart I am. I'll impress you.
Yeah.
That doesn't really go to, everybody's busy. No one's got time for that stuff.
Right.
But now you have to work on making sure people know about it. That's where all the work is.
And I don't have the great voice you do. You sound like a Wolfman Jack cop, you know? It's just
now you're aging me and you. Here's the old joke is, if I knew I was going to live this long, I'd take much better care of myself.
Exactly.
And I would have saved a lot more money than I'm doing now.
Gosh,
oh, my God. You kidding me?
If I'd known then what I know now. But then I got divorced, and there went mine.
And that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But it turned out to be the best thing in the world for both her and I. Because I met my wife now. We've been married 25 years, and she is literally the love of my life. And she gets me. She doesn't understand all the police stuff, but I jokingly say she got the good stuff. The first one had to go through the bad stuff. And while we're talking about the bad stuff, it wasn't what people think. It's not the stereotypes. I was not the kind of guy I wanted to be. And I certainly wasn't the kind of guy I planned to be. I thank God daily I'm not the guy I used to be.
I think what you're talking about is the checking out part, not being engaged. And
exactly.
Like you said, it's just the not being there for her, not realizing what the impact is of what your trauma is.
Oh, yeah.
And that, I think, is a huge part of why many law enforcement and military personnel get divorced. It's just a completely different world.
They do. And a big part of it, too, is... See, I was doing this thing that it took people to explain to me. I was pouring massive amounts of a depressant down my throat every night so I could sleep, alcohol, and I was getting severely depressed. I was getting suicidal. So my ex-wife did not sign up for that. She married a guy who was 28, 29, or we were 30 when we got married. I got diagnosed right around the same time. So maybe 30. And within 2 years, I was a totally different guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that different.
It's shocking, isn't it? How fast that can happen, and the impact that trauma has on us. Have you ever gone through any trauma-informed type training that I talk about, the neuroscience of the brain and what happens inside your head with trauma? Do you have
I have from you. I've listened to you. I also have someone on the show quite often, and he's in Montana now. He was a Brevard County Sheriff's deputy, and he talks about a lot of that too. And a lot of it makes sense. But see, the early days, they talked about that. I know psychiatrists don't like this. I avoid certain things. And I know that's not a term that's very hip, slick, and cool. I'd love to tell you that I can handle anything because I can't. So I don't watch body camera videos. I don't watch dash cam videos of bad stuff happening. If movies are too realistic, I turn that stuff off. If I find myself getting angry I realize now the neuroscience thing, that there is a very short trip, and I don't understand it, but a very short trip from being angry to it triggers a lot of the physiological PTSD things that I cannot deal with. And it takes me too long to get my center back. And I don't want to be apologizing, Dave. I don't want to be the guy saying, I'm sorry, I did this, I did that, I punched the wall. I don't want to be that guy. So I now do certain things. I eat around the same time every day, every meal around the same time. I go to sleep around the same time every night. I try to wake up the same time every day. I don't take naps. I got sober. I don't drink alcohol. I don't understand the correlation with that, but for me only, drinking alcohol is like pouring gasoline on a PTSD fire. I don't get it, but man, I lose it.
It's a great analogy. It speaks to exactly what I'm talking about in terms of what the brain goes through with trauma. There's so much denial and there's so much shame and other kinds of things built into that. But the issue that I find isn't so much the neuroscience of the brain in trauma, but it's just the whole mentality. The issue of rape and sexual assault is so difficult to talk about to cops. I get so much pushback when I start talking about start by believing, and here's the neuroscience, and here's why victims and survivors can't talk about it and have difficulty putting things in chronological order and have difficulty recalling certain aspects of the trauma. All the stuff that you're talking about, I know you can relate to what I'm saying. But when it comes to rape and sex assault, is that concept that if she hadn't done this, if she hadn't done that, if she hadn't been wearing this, if she hadn't been drinking as much, if she hadn't been, if she hadn't, it turns into victim blaming. And then when you start victim blaming, it's really easy to not believe their story. And so the two biggest things that re-traumatize victims, besides the rape and sex assault that they've gone through, is having law enforcement not believe them and blame them for their own crime. And what I'm trying to convince law enforcement of is that, yes, there's that physical evidence. There's the things they say, the things they tell. But I think this applies with you specifically when I talk about the psychophysiological evidence. What happened to you that caused you to have a disability, to cause you to have to retire? You could show the day when everything changed for you. So I call it psychophysiological evidence. All of the things that you talked about leading up to this, about drinking more, having to have some sort of medication to help you, and the way you reacted to people, that anger, that response is all psychophysiological evidence. We could use that in court and say, here's proof that John Jay went through this because his life changed. It turned his world upside down. What I'm trying to convince cops today to do is take that same psychophysiological evidence that victims and survivors go through in their survival, in their recovery, and say, this shows that what she or he is saying about being raped or sexually assaulted is proven by their reactions, the way their life changed. And it's
this is
really
where it's
hard.
a little bit different for you and I. You were a detective.
Yeah.
So you spent more time on the victim side. I was the initial patrol guy that showed up on the call.
Yep.
And so we had a different role.
Yeah.
And the role for mine was, let's get the evidence.
Yeah.
Let's make sure they're okay. I tried my best to, and we said this in an interview with you, was, okay, I'm going to take you to the hospital, or to mom, or was going to take you to the hospital. They're going to do a rape kit. It's going to be a very intrusive type exam, but we got to get evidence. And so your verbal evidence is evidence.
Yep.
Right? Doesn't matter whether you believe or not, it's evidence. And it's not my job to weigh the value of that evidence.
Correct.
It's someone else's job. It's a detective's job. It's a prosecutor's job. It's a jury's job. It's a judge's job. Someone else's. So I want to get the physical evidence, and I want to get the verbal evidence or the eyewitness testimony, and then build a case as best I can. Usually it means do the basics and then hand it over to people like you, and you spend more time with them. And that's where I think a lot of times we drop the ball. And it could do with clearance rates. It could do with a lot of other things. The city hall and the command staff we got to get our part 1 felonies down, and we got to get our rapes down. We got to get this down. And you and I both know what that drill's about. Mm-hmm. But from my point of view, it was hands-on, it was initial, and it was raw, but it wasn't very long-term.
What I would love for any law enforcement personnel who are listening to this to really absorb is what you just said, because that first responder impact on a victim is critical. If you approach those cases, those rapes and sex assaults, the way you talk about having done, you are putting that victim in a place where they are much more willing to be cooperative. If you're empathic, if you're understanding, if you're compassionate in the way you treat them and your response to them, like you said, whether it happened or not is not up for you to decide.
Right.
You're just there to collect that evidence. But even just that initial approach of, I'm here to talk to you. I need to hear what's going on. If you're able and willing, I'd love to hear everything that you have to say about your experience of being raped or sexually assaulted. Jess Michaels, one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, is now putting together an app called Sexual Assault First Aid. And it's teaching people that rape and sexual assault is just like somebody being shot, just like somebody breaking their leg, just like somebody being
It's like a robbery. It's really no difference.
Yeah. You've got
It's a horribly invasive crime. And part of it, Dave, is we got to get rid of the mindset of, and I was guilty of this as the day is long until I got in police work and the training and all this stuff. I viewed rape as a sex crime. And I know that's what it's called, but it's really a crime of violence and domination. And it's really not about sexual gratification. I remember vividly in the police academy, we had this instructor who was a female officer, and she talked about investigating sex crimes. And this is early on. And one thing she said is she talked about the different types of rapists. She had the power rapists, she had the psychopaths, she had the sociopaths, she had all these other ones. She said, now, if you get the wrong type of rapist, and let's just say you go for that defense of blowing the whistle, what are they going to do? She said, probably going to turn from a rape victim to a homicide victim. So you got to know who you're dealing with. And that began the process of opening my eyes, because I started thinking differently about these crimes. Now, if I get reported for armed robbery, how do I know it occurred? I don't know it occurred, but doesn't mean I don't do my job. It's the same way with rape and sex assaults.
Yeah. John Jay, what you're saying is so important. I'm so thankful that you have the attitude you do and the approach to all of this that you had, because it's important. People need to hear this in the law enforcement realm, but victims and survivors need to hear this too. They need to know that we're getting the word out, that we're doing everything we can to change this rape culture, to change this mentality of what we've been doing for eons past in terms of our history, how we treat victims and survivors of rape. So I'm grateful for everything that you've said and the fact that you have that passion.
The main passion for me is, and I know this might sound a little cold, and I don't want it to sound that way, so I apologize in advance, but people can't change what happened to them. You've got no power over what happened yesterday. You've got no power over what happened 5, 10 years ago. I had to learn to accept that these bad things happen. When I say accept, doesn't mean I liked it. Doesn't mean I forgave anybody. Doesn't mean I said it's okay. It means I had to accept that I am different now. Now, for me, being different doesn't mean bad. It just means I've got to do things differently. And if I want to have the nice house with a white picket fence, that means there's things I got to do. Not them. They're in prison, or they're wherever they are, or they're dead, or whatever it might be. It's not them. It's my choice. And see, that's where the power comes in. You can't change that you were victimized, but you have the power to decide what you can do with that today. And as soon as we begin to realize that, that's when the aha moments start for us. And what I call the hell days, they start to become less and less frequent.
So good, so accurate, and so spot on. I appreciate that. I don't know where to go next.
How about this? How are you doing today? I'm going to turn the table on you, because you're interviewing me, doing a great job. You've been retired from policing for quite a while now, and I had you on my show and you told some of your story. But what we didn't get into was, I know your mission. I think it's a great mission. But how are you doing? How's your life? Is it where you want it to be?
I'm kind of like you when you were in that really troubled spot. You don't want to bleed all over everybody, but sometimes you can't help it. I'm not bleeding all over anybody, but it's really hard for me to talk about things that are difficult in my life, because I don't want anybody to have to feel responsible for doing what they can to help me, whether it's my wife
You just nailed it.
Yeah.
I don't want to burden people.
Exactly. I will tell you this. This podcast has turned my life upside down. I started it in November of 2022, so it's coming up on 2 years. I'm doing it because I love the idea of helping victims and survivors in their healing journey, but also knowing that it's causing the creation of a community where we're helping each other. So I get a lot out of this. I'm a sex assault victim from both my childhood and in my adult life.
Yeah, I never heard you say that.
I don't talk about it a whole lot. I've mentioned it a couple of times on my show.
Part of that is the male stereotype that we carry around. Look, you and I are from the same generation. And I look at my father's generation, and they were tougher than we were. They didn't talk about nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing. And I look at the World War II generation, and they were even tougher. I remember a lot of the Vietnam vets, they didn't talk about this stuff. They talked about other people. They said, yeah, I have other people I talk to. My dad was dying of cancer. He goes, I have other people I talk to. I have other people I complain to. It's not going to be you. And that was his philosophy. When I tell people things happen to me, I do keep some control. It's another term that psychologists don't like. I do keep some control. I'm not going to give you everything. Yep. First of all, everything about me isn't for everybody. Secondly, you've earned a right to hear some of my story, but a lot of people do not. And I don't particularly want to go there. So when I give you little bits and pieces about what I've went through, I'm not going to tell you the whole deal. So I'm going to keep some of it close to the chest. But part of it is the male stereotype that you should handle this. Yeah. You should be okay with this. And by the way, even as a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, you're supposed to be a tough guy.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way
that shouldn't happen to you.
That's the way we're socialized.
And we carry that guilt and shame around in our 50s and 60s and go, I was 4 years old. I was 5 years old. I was 10. I didn't know. I didn't know how to defend myself.
Right. Yeah.
We don't tell ourselves that. That makes too much sense. We go with the emotional stuff.
Yeah, well, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know, especially at that age. But even as you're growing older and into adulthood, a lot of that stuff just doesn't make sense. And like you said, because we're socialized to be tough and not talk about stuff and not be emotional, we hide it, we suppress it. It's not talked about. The reason I started talking about it is because I want people to know that I understand where they're coming from when they're on my show.
And you also, you are an example that you can get beyond this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just because this happened to you doesn't mean it explains, and it's not an identifier that something, I'm going to be known by everybody. I thought I wore that scarlet letter on my chest, exactly. Like they have in the movie or the television show or the book, whatever it was.
Right.
I thought everybody knew. Let me ask you this, Dave. I was walking my dog down the street the other night. My wife and I live in a really nice neighborhood. And it was a day that the cargo ship hit the Francis Scott Key Bridge and went into the inner harbor. Okay. Of course, that was where I worked in Baltimore. And it brought back a flood of stuff to me. But it was very late at night, and I was thinking to myself, and I apologize if I get emotional. I was thinking to myself, and I told her afterwards, I said, I'm not right. I'm thinking about all these things that I haven't thought about for years. But the question was, why did we have to go through all that stuff to get to where we're at today? I don't understand that. And the other one was, and this is the question I'm going to ask you. I thought if other people knew, would they treat me differently? And that was the thing that it's like somehow there's some shame tied into this. Look, I didn't cause people to shoot at me. I didn't cause a lot of these things. It was not my choice. They said, you know what you signed up for? Yeah, I did, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. It was a lot worse. But there's still shame involved in it. And a lot of it is because I'm afraid that people will find out what I don't want to tell them. And I don't know how to describe it any better. And I see that all over your face when you tell your story. This happened to me, but I'm not going to tell you everything.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
And it's okay. You don't have to.
And I know that intellectually.
But it's a long trip from your head to your heart, isn't it?
It's crazy.
It's a long journey.
Boy, is it. Yeah. I can tell you, as you were saying what you were saying, and me thinking back to the first time I did tell somebody was when I was working for the Army as a trainer consultant. I was a highly qualified expert standing in front of a group of soldiers, male and female soldiers, who I was scared to death to say what I said. Really don't even know where it came from, but I said it anyway. I was sexually assaulted. And the story I told them was what happened to me in college. It was a sex assault. It was like you said. He got no sexual gratification out of it. He got power and control out of it.
Power and control and dominance.
And dominance. Yeah, absolutely. But boy, the shame I carried around with me. Like you said, I walked around campus for the remainder of the time I was on that campus thinking everybody knew. Yeah. And so that impacts me, but it also gives me motivation and inspiration to do what I'm doing. The reason I started the podcast was because 4 women who had been raped on their respective college campuses in upstate New York were on a panel. in an afternoon session of a seminar that I was teaching. I taught a 4-hour morning session, and the panel that they were on was on the 4 hours afternoon. They were there early and heard everything that I said that morning. I stuck around that afternoon and heard everything they said. All 4 of them came up to me afterward and said, Dave, are you teaching survivors and victims of rape and sexual assault the same things that you're teaching these cops and prosecutors and victim advocates about the neuroscience of trauma and memory and the impact? And I said, no, I've never specifically talked to an audience of victims and survivors. And all 4 of them at the same time, you need to. We got so much out of what you taught these cops, victim advocates, and mental health workers. It answered so much of what's going on internally for us and how we have these intrusive memories and we have these nightmares that wake us up and we have things that we wish we could remember about the incident because it would fill in so many blanks. But there are other things about the experience that we wish we could forget and we can't. You need to teach this to victims and survivors. Start a podcast. Well, it took me 7 years to start that podcast because you were
in the formative stages for 7 years.
I was like scared to death. Why would I talk about this? Why would I invite people who have been through this to be on a show? But my wife kept saying, do it. It's a great idea. Start a podcast. When I finally did, like I said, I started small. I think the only people that knew I was doing it were people in law enforcement with me when I was back in Lafayette. I told some of them. And then a lot of the military personnel that I had gotten close to and the training consulting aspect of my business told them that it was out there. It just exploded. And I have people texting me and emailing me almost daily. Dave, this podcast saved my life. Dave, this podcast gets me through the day. Dave, the community that I feel with your guests is unbelievably powerful. It's changed my life. Keep doing what you're doing. I get a keep doing what you're doing comment almost every day. And it does. It inspires me.
The motivation part of why you do it is got to stay there. It's always going to be part of it.
That's critically important, not just for me, not just for this podcast, but for the audience that hears this. It's so inspiring because there are so many commonalities about what we're talking about from my life, from your life, that they're experiencing. And when they tune in and hear some of this and go, yeah, I've heard that before, but hearing it from him, the way he said it, is different, and it makes an impact for me. And John Jay, I can't tell you what an impact you've had, not only for the show, but just for me personally as a host. I appreciate you.
I appreciate it too. And the one piece of advice I would give is the people that have gone through this, they have a tough deal. And one of the best things that you can do as a spouse, as a parent, or whatever it might be, is do not push them to more than what they're willing to tell you. Here's the other thing is don't try to, I know how you feel. No, you don't know how they feel. Just accept that this is the way they are.
John, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
My pleasure. Anything I can do in our journey together, we're more than happy to help.
Thanks, John Jay.
Be well, Dave. We'll talk to you soon.
Alrighty. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. I hope you were as captivated and enthralled by John Jay as I was. His story, his pain, his trauma takeaways, and his healing journey are simply an inspiration to hear and absorb. John Jay, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your strength and fortitude in telling us about your trauma and amazing healing story. I know my audience has benefited from your presence here today. Hey listeners, if you were impressed by John Jay's story and want to share your thoughts and how you were impacted by listening in, send me an email telling me about it, and I'll read some of those responses on the air next week. My email address is in the episode notes, and I look forward to hearing from you. And I hope you look forward to next week when I'll have another sexual assault survivor story to share with you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you tuning in. Please remember to do your part to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. An important way to accomplish this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.